Hi everyone, this is a review of Chapter 10, Social Media, for Social 102 Social Problems. Okay, so what is the media? Media just refers to channels of communication. So under the banner of the media, there's the mass media and social media. So mass media refers to the means to transmit information from a single source to a vast number of people. So mass media outlets are things like radio stations, newspaper publishers. They create content that reaches large audiences. So newspapers, of course, came about after the invention of the printing press in the 15th century. So newspapers have been important in human civilization for a long time now. By about 1800, newspapers in some European cities reached a circulation of 1 million people. So we've had them with us for a while, but in recent years, because of technological changes, they've kind of retreated or just fallen as far as readership and subscriptions and things like that, largely because we have social media. So anyway, and there's reasons that that's problematic, as we'll talk about later. Radio is another form of mass media that was invented in the late 1880s, and this kind of wireless transmission was then soon used even across not just land but also sea. So the first commercial radio station started broadcasting in 1920, and since the 1920s, it's been a large feature of our way of getting information and staying connected with one another. And then, of course, television, right, is a big form of mass media. Commercial television broadcasting began in 1928, and by the 50s, most homes in the U.S. had at least one television with programming from three major networks, NBC, ABC, and CBS. So, of course, television's expanded quite a bit since then, and nowadays we have even more kind of proliferations of what television is beyond, the major networks. We went into the cable world and then beyond cable, like the streaming world. So this continues to be kind of in flux. And then, of course, social media, where mass media transmits information in a single direction, right, from the publisher to the masses. Social media links millions of people in a very interactive network of which information flows in all directions. So social media first emerged only after the development of computers and the internet. In a world that was shaped by the Cold War, the purpose of the internet was to serve as a decentralized communication system. So, meaning there was no centralized broadcast point that was vulnerable to military attack. But what has it become now? It's kind of spiraled into a whole different world, right? Where as much as we can share information with each other, we can also really clearly and easily share misinformation with each other, which is a huge problem of our current age. Okay, so looking at issues and controversies in the media. So first, when it comes to media and the message, the technology we use in society shapes the way that we understand the world. So media doesn't just transmit information, it also shapes the message that we're receiving. This is what is called media framing, meaning let's say I'm reporting on a story. The perspectives I show and the angle in which I show them is one framing. But think about it if you were aiming your camera, even from your camera phone at something. Think about when you're aiming your phone at that, what are all the things you're missing that are around that particular angle you're using? That's kind of the way, a easy way to think of media framing, that we stand in one perspective and we report from that perspective. And if that perspective is the state, powerful interests, not really from the perspective of citizens, we're often getting, news that's being framed for us to fit a particular ideology or dialogue. So when you want to understand media framing, you have to really look at how a story is framed and think about what's being included and what's not being included. Who's being interviewed and who's not, right? Like if you're looking at war coverage and the only people being interviewed are people embedded with troops, how does that affect the message, right? If you have situations where, you're talking about economic downturns and only from the perspective of people on Wall Street, then that's not really framing the reality for most people when it comes to economic downturns, right? So anyway, media really sends certain messages, and as I put in your additional resources talking about the kind of scholars that look at media framing, that oftentimes it can lead to this kind of what's called manufactured consent, and basically developed into this concept that sometimes the way that the media frames messages can affect the way that we then perceive them and can affect our our support or consent for certain actions. How things are framed make a difference in affecting our consent and our understandings, our social understandings as citizens. So anyway, media in that way, it really, it can shape our reality for us, right? So the development of mass media has really changed how people interact. And especially with social media, people now interact with thousands of people that they'll never even meet. So, also when it comes to the workplace, the book talks about how social media and especially computer technology has really changed how workplace settings are. They're less personal. And really because, again, a lot of media has changed the quality of our leisure pursuits into you sit on your phone and scroll instead of like, I don't know, you go to the park and you like feed a duck or something. Like you do things where, when I was a kid in a very analog childhood, if you were a kid, you went out and you like rode your bike. Or maybe, yeah, you played video games or something like that was more technological, but you pretty much just kind of like, got outside and moved around. And because of the kind of influence of not just computer technology, but especially social media on younger and younger generations, so much time is spent, whether it's being on social media, making content for social media, it just really has changed a lot of personal relationships. So again, media shapes reality in a lot of ways. So the way that news is presented is also very important. The chapter looks at the idea of news bites, or what we call sound bites. The idea that they'll take like a 2-hour long speech and clip it down into like a 1-sentence thing. And it's really, really easy to misinterpret things when it's done like that, right? So, they talk about the whole Kennedy-Nixon presidential debate and how the people that listened to the debate on the radio back in 1960, they thought that Nixon won, but people who watched it on TV thought that Kennedy won. So the fact that like how people look and how they present themselves and like how much flop sweat Nixon was struggling with, again, if you've seen the footage, then that really changes the perspective people have of like who they're voting for. So especially as a person who personally, I study media and politics, this is a big one for me, where I'm trying not to tangent, but there's so much there when it comes to the ways in which our political coverage and the way that we understand candidates is really controlled by the media. And if we don't have access to sources of media that can provide us with information, it can be very detrimental to our ability to have good voter choices. So in my own research, I asked people about their media sources they used and some of the narratives that they learned from them. And what I found was interesting was across the board, every person from every political ideology, I talked to people from various different political party affiliations, and all of them said they had to go out of their way to find information about candidates, to find information about propositions, to find information, before they could make informed voting choices. And a lot of us just don't have that time and energy. Or, as a person who, again, works at a library for many years, most people don't know how to search the internet correctly. They can't sort the, fact from the fiction when they find some sources. So that's a whole nother problem, right? And so it should be interesting that when media, back in that 1960 time period with Kennedy and Nixon, media was much more kind of centered on actually showing the whole debate, right? Like I said, they played the whole debate on radio. Nowadays, they wouldn't have time in the media landscape because they're trying to cover this, and that all the time. They often give us sound bites. So they'll give us like a sentence here or there. This is one moment that it said. But again, out of the context of the entire speech, it can really change what the meaning of that sentence was. One example could be, this happened to Obama back in the day, where basically Republicans took one of his sentences out of context. He was talking about how small businesses don't exist in a vacuum. Their success and opportunity also rests on the fact that there's a lot of political, government investment in the roads, in the supply chains, in computer technology and the internet, and all of these kind of things that small businesses can thrive because they have the internet to rely on, because they have roads, because they have shipping companies to send their goods and things like this. Just to kind of say that, we don't exist in a vacuum. We're all part of a society. So, if someone benefits, like Amazon, financially from the system that's been set up by the government, then they should have to pay their, taxes and fair share so that they can have opportunities for other Amazons to rise or other, people to have that entrepreneurial spirit and be able to kind of, thrive in their business. So anyway, they took one little part of his speech, and it was just this part where he's like, you didn't build that. And they took that clip and they played it over and over and over and over and over during the 2012 presidential election cycle, saying he's telling small businesses that you didn't build your business. And it was just such an interesting show of how sound bites can be used to completely change the argument and reframe something to basically farcicalness to a point where it's not at all what they're saying. Actually, this also happened to Hillary Clinton. And I believe, oh, come on, what year was it? Was it 2016? Yeah. It was the last nightmare in 2016. So basically, she said something about coal miners, and it was largely because she had a plan to, small backstory on coal miners. There's less coal miners than there are people who work at Wendy's, right, the fast food restaurant. So the idea was coal miners suffer from a lot of ailments like black lung from being in the coal mines. It's very dangerous work. Some people die, get injuries or die in cave-ins, all sorts of horrible stuff. And basically, we need to transition to, away from these fossil fuels to renewable energies so that our planet doesn't burn up and we don't all die, right? Little things like that. And so when she was running in 2016, she had this plan to basically create a fund of money that would make it so coal miners could get trained for free. Like they could receive college education for free, they could receive training for free to go to different industries, right? So let's say you take a coal miner and you train him in how to provide high-speed internet, because a lot of the areas that are rural that have coal mines also don't have high-speed internet still to this day, right? Or you take that coal miner and you teach them how to install solar panels or windmills or something else that, again, other sources of energy that are needed but also are sustainable and aren't going to harm the people that are doing them, right? It's not like by installing solar panels you get sick and die, or by putting up windmills you get sick and die, but you do get sick and die from working in petrochemical plants, from working in, coal industry, all of that kind of stuff. So it's very problematic to health, but also to our health in general, because those pollutants are going out into the atmosphere. So anywho, basically she said, okay, I'm going to transition all these people out of coal. And so she said, I'm going to put these coal mines out of business. And they just took that one clip of her saying, I'm going to put coal mines out of business, and played it over and over and over and over and over in states like West Virginia that have a lot of coal mining. And this really shifted a lot of voters' perceptions of her candidacy. So again, if you take a 30-second clip and you take it out of context, it's really easy to misinterpret what those politicians are saying, right, through sound bites. Another issue with political coverage and mass media is what's called horse race coverage. The idea that the majority of the coverage focuses on percentages and polls, like this person has 27% in this poll, and this person has 32% in this poll, instead of actually talking about who is the candidate, what makes them qualified, what's their platform, what are their policy positions, right? What do they believe in, what do they believe against? Those are the things that citizens actually want to know before they vote for somebody. And that's really largely not being done by our media at this point, because they focus so much on the horse race. Another issue is media bias. So President Trump, along with various conservative and alt-right, or what we should just call white supremacists, they call themselves alt-right, like they get to rebrand themselves, and when they're like, you're Nazis. But anyway, these alt-right media outlets would claim that mainstream media, right, these popular newspapers and television stations, have a liberal bias, right? While, again, there's this kind of saying that goes with that says, corporations, media corporations only have as liberal a bias as the corporations who own them. So corporate media is really beholden to the advertisers and the sponsors. So the idea that it has a liberal bias is actually kind of comical in a lot of ways, because, again, they're really just reporting on things in the ways that the pharmaceutical industry wants, the fossil fuel industry wants. So this is why even on very kind of left-wing, supposedly left-wing stations like MSNBC, you still see all the the people that used to work for the Bush White House. You see all the people that worked for Trump. They're all getting interviewed on there and getting airtime. Kellyanne Conway's been on there like a billion times, right? So it's kind of interesting that they malign the media for being so liberal when actually, pretty markedly, a lot of the media is very conservative and really is very pro-business, pro-corporation, which again kind of goes against that liberal or even progressive, a whole different level kind of representation. Someone like Bernie Sanders or others speaking for the political left really claim that large corporations are not challenging the status quo. And a lot of research shows that outlets like the Wall Street Journal and Fox News are very conservative, and other outlets like NPR and the New York Times are more liberal or progressive. And again, I would really argue against the New York Times on that one. Ooh, personally, maybe that was true 15, 20 years ago. But nowadays, you'd be shocked to see some of the stuff that comes out of the New York Times that's peddled as if it's left wing, and it's incredibly pro Wall Street, pro corporation. So it's interesting how when it comes to bias, it's very problematic. But a lot of media does have bias, but not all media has bias, right? It's really about the fact that a lot of media outlets select stories and present them in a way to attract an audience in order to increase profits. So if their corporate interests or the people who are buying the ads on their programs don't like the stuff they're covering, they're not going to get that ad revenue. So that's really what shapes it. This is why I really highly suggest, as a person who studies media, if you want better sources of information, find listener-sponsored media. And not just all the wingnuts on YouTube, but actual established shows that they use their support from the community to pay for the production of news instead of getting advertisers to pay for the production of news, and that means they're no longer beholden to the advertisers to cover a story in a particular fashion. So media literacy is very important to deal with media framing and media bias and really understand whose perspective is shaping what's being told, and are we getting a better accurate form of news? And again, how do you get past a lot of the bias? Not just find things that are listener sponsored, but also find sources of media that are varied and come from different perspectives. You're going to get different kinds of understandings of the news, right? And you can make your own informed decision based on that information. So media literacy just refers to the capacity to be a critical consumer of mass media. It involves discerning what message is being presented, assessing the source of the information, and using multiple outlets to assess the degree of bias. So nowadays we have this issue of the digital divide, which refers to the disparities in access to the internet for various categories of people around the world or within our nation. About half the world's people are using the internet, and about half are not. The share of any nation's population that's using the internet is correlated with their level of economic development, and in some cases, the degree to which the government controls access to information, right? Because in some countries, the internet is a very closed system to outside, connections. So within the U.S. population, age is the strongest predictor of internet use. Whereas 99% of young adults use the internet, just 60% of people over 65 do use the internet. I would say they might not use the internet that much, but they use Facebook. Okay, moving into social media problems for individuals. So social media, it's really the best example of the presentation of self that we have, right? Remember, this was Goffman's analysis on face-to-face interactions. So he calls it the presentation of self, this idea that we want to show our best version of ourselves to the world. So in a cyber world, though, we present ourselves using online apps, and we transmit a carefully crafted identity to an audience. And so typically the self that's present in the online is idealized using carefully edited words and images that both present and distort reality. It just puts out the best version of ourselves. And what's really interesting about this too is that then we look at other people's lives and we think they have a better life, but in reality they're just better at the presentation of self in their social media. Just one quick example of that. It really came to the forefront for me when there were two couples that I kind of aspired my relationship to be like theirs, because they were so perfect, right? They had social media perfect. They were always going out and doing things together, and they just looked so happy. And, I was like, man, I wish I was more like them, right? I wish that me and, my partner were more like them. And then they both got divorced in the same year, a couple of years ago. And I was like, wait, what? I was like, I don't believe in love anymore. Like, I was like disillusioned, even though I'm still with my partner. And we realized it was because they were just really, really good at the presentation of self. We didn't realize that in one of the relationships, which was actually my now husband's best friend from like kindergarten, we didn't know that there was like cheating going on in that relationship and all sorts of like infidelity stuff. We didn't know with the other couple that was my cousins, actually, that, there was a lot more conflict than you see on the surface, because people don't post images of them fighting. They don't post images of their bad hair day or them just, kind of feeling depressed. They only post things that you have a positive presentation of self. And so this idealized self can really affect how we then see each other, because we're only seeing that idealized version and not the real person. So it kind of distorts it, because now we end up spending more time interacting with the fake version, like through any of these, like TikTok, Instagram, whatever it might be. You interact with the fake version more so than you interact with the real one. And now everyone's trying to be an influencer, because that's kind of the media landscape nowadays. So really, this can really affect people's self-image. So that's a big part of, social media can be damaging, right, to people's self-image. So people build a self-image, again, imagining how other people see them. And so often when we're in our development, sociologically, our parents and our peer influences have an impact on who we are and how we present ourselves. But in a digital age, the responses we receive is really about, what do we post and how many people like it? Do enough people like it? Do people write mean things about it, right? Those kind of things. And so, those of us who use social media and receive negative feedback, like you don't get a lot of likes, it can really carry the risk of feeling rejection and even experiencing depression symptoms. So also when it comes to social media and empathy, research shows that to the extent that someone uses social media and they replace face-to-face interactions, the individuals experience a reduced capacity for empathy, or the ability to imagine themselves in someone else's shoes, right? To kind of think of from someone else's perspective. So Sherry Turkle documented a decline in empathy among today's young people compared to those of earlier generations. And some of this might really have to do with spending so much time in this kind of detached reality online instead of, interacting face-to-face with others. So also there's this issue of social media and conformity. Researchers have long documented our tendency to conform to attitudes and behaviors of those around us. So a UCLA study found that subjects that assessed photos that were presented with more likes, they thought those photos were better than photos that had fewer likes. So not only, it's kind of interesting, right? Like you're looking at a picture and you can either determine, like you're looking at something on Instagram, oh, I think this is a good picture. But then you look down and there's only a few likes. You're like, well, maybe it's not a good picture, right? And it literally can affect you in those kind of very subtle ways. But there's so many ways in which, I think a bigger part of this too has to do with how we're all trying to be like the influencers. And if you've seen them, if you've watched them, you know that their lives are not like most people's lives. They have like, oh my God, the backgrounds. I'll see some of these women post from their kitchen and I'm like, oh my God. My kitchen's like, you can't put out both your arms to the side or you'll run into everything. And they have these kitchens that are like as big as my apartment. I'm like, what is your life, right? And that's kind of part of the problem. It's this like, this wish to be something that we're not, or at least something that they're presenting as they are. We don't know that that's really their life. They could be in Airbnb pretending that that's their life, right? People can really, really mask their reality and produce the most idealized version nowadays because of social media. So also, when it comes to social media multitasking and attention span, social media enhances our ability to engage in multitasking or engaging with more than one physical or mental activity at a time. So multitasking can produce more productivity, but really, let's be real, it really distracts us. So like if you're texting while you're driving, please stop doing that. I'm the person in the car next to you being like shaking my fist like, God damn it, stop doing that. So like, please stop doing that. You're going to kill us all. Right. But again, researchers really show how because of social media, we're spending so much time looking at it and scrolling that this can actually reduce our attention span. Like think about it from the TikTok situation or even with Instagram, like the kind of stories, it can only be 15 seconds. that really affects the kind of attention span you have for things. Like I'll send stuff to my husband that are like, like a 2 or 3 minute video, and he's like, oh, 2 minute video. And I'm like, you should be able to sit through 2 minutes of video. It shouldn't be that hard, especially because it's a very funny cat video. No, I'm just kidding. But it probably is a cat video, actually. But anyway, it's this idea, though, that the more we do this stuff, actually, I heard some research recently that was talking about, instead of multitasking, they call it multi-slacking. And I tend to do this myself, where you like put on the TV, you got your laptop in front of you, you got your phone next to you, or your tablet or whatever it might be, and you're just kind of like not paying attention to all three of them, right? And we think we're being more productive because I'm like, oh, I'm doing this and I'm doing that. But it spreads our ability to focus on one thing across those things, right? Some more problems for individuals when it comes to social media. A big one is cyberbullying, right? So this refers to using the internet to embarrass, abuse, or manipulate other people. And this has had such a detrimental impact on younger generations because bullying has been a feature of a lot of people's lives for a long time, but the difference is with cyberbullying, you can't leave. Like, it's not a matter of you go home and it stops, or you can go to, maybe you switch schools and it stops. Cyberbullying, it feels like it follows these kids everywhere. And as a result, this has really had a strong impact on, the suicide rate for a lot of youth that are going through stuff when they're being cyberbullied, because again, it just feels like it's something they can't escape. Also, social media is strongly linked to depression in a lot of research studies. Research shows that teens who use social media for more than 3 hours a day are 1/3 more likely to experience feelings of hopelessness and depression, and to report thoughts about suicide than teens who use social media for less than 2 hours a day. So even just how long you're on it can really affect you, but you got to think about the cumulative effects of that, of every day, of spending so many hours and so many hours, and how that really can add up to really affecting people inside. And then, of course, social media and addiction, right? Research supports the conclusion that the use of social media carries a risk of addiction. In part, the risk follows from any activity that stimulates the pleasure centers of the brain. So the producers of social media also, though, they've intentionally designed their products with the goal of maximizing user engagement. So hint, they make them addictive, right? This is why you get notifications for things. So it's basically like, I noticed this myself, I had to in recent years, because especially with the pandemic and everything else, our mental health has all taken a hit. So the last thing we need is more of that. So I know for myself, like especially Twitter, I had to just turn off notifications. Because Twitter is just like it's a place you go to stream or to like just scroll through and get like rage. Or just like for me, to watch comedians like make fun of people. But anyway, that as a result, every time you set it down and you get this notification, it's like this like spike adrenaline that you go back to it and back to it and back to it. And then it becomes this addictive force, right? Especially this idea when we feel very disconnected, getting a message, getting, some sort of notification that someone messaged you or said something to you or said something about you makes you want to connect back to it. But there's no real connection there. And I think if we have real connection in our lives and some social media, it can be mitigated, some of the negatives. But the more and more we get isolated and we don't have real people in our lives to kind of counter the relationships on social media, it just becomes more and more toxic and problematic for individuals. Okay, so social media also has problems for relationships. So, part of this is they talk about the changing importance of physical location, meaning social media allows us to connect to a far larger number of people than ever before across space, right? So much space. So instead of concentrating our social ties within our physical community of like where we're, the locations around us, social media knows no bounds, so it makes physical proximity irrelevant. And so that can be good. Like, let's say you're a member of a marginalized community and there's no one in your town that experiences what you do. Like let's say a trans youth in an area that's very conservative and you want to find other people that support you and care about you, then having these online communities can be very helpful. But on the flip side of that, oftentimes we then ignore the relationships in our areas, in our world, and don't engage with the physical spaces around us, which just kind of makes us more and more disconnected. It's like cyclical loop where the more disconnected you get, the more you turn to the social media, and the more you turn to the social media, the more disconnected you get, and it just kind of cycles through. Also, when it comes to parenting, use of social media allows parents to have far greater knowledge about their child's location and activities than in earlier generations. And parents can monitor their children's online activity, and they should, because of the danger of predators, right? The only problem for me, though, is, at least in my perspective, because I'm the age of people having children. I'm like the weirdo that I don't have children at this point. But anyway, basically, parents spend a lot of their time on social media now. And so much of how they present their lives and their children and their everything is that, too. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've seen a video of something, especially through TikTok, where you're like, you shouldn't have been videoing this. You should have been putting down your phone and helping your child, right? You know what I mean? Like their kid's falling over the side of something and they're like videotaping it. And you're like, put your phone down and interact with your child. So I wonder, when the research comes through, longitudinally later on, what the impact of having distracted parents that are always on their phones and not engaging with their children, how much that's going to affect, parent-child bonds and other kind of developmental thresholds. Because I know if I have children, I mean, obviously we're all going to have phones, we're all going to still interact with these things, but you just have to have times in which you put it away so you can still connect in that kind of way that we've been connecting for thousands of years as human beings. Okay, so then again, predators are a big problem, especially they're a serious danger to young people. Because young people using social media are not going to be savvy or understand that someone's, manipulating them. So relationships typically begin online and eventually lead to an in-person meeting that can involve sexual victimization. So it's really important to keep kids away from predators, and social media is like the ideal hunting ground for predators, especially because parents let their kids get accounts so young. And again, that's got to be, personally, I'm older than all of you. Social media really became a thing through like MySpace when I was in my young adult years, but I was still like, I don't know, not savvy enough. I'd say I was just like suspicious of it. Like, why should I put all my information out there? How are they going to use that against me? So I really didn't. And it's interesting to see how like nowadays kids just grow up, they post everything about themselves. Think about what that does for a predator. When a little kid is saying, this is where I live, this is what, my room looks like, this is what everything, like, it gives so much information to someone that could do them harm. So that's a big problem. Another one, though, what's another interesting part of how things have changed because of social media would be dating, right? An increased share of dating apps now take place through, and really kind of interact through a lot of these social media platforms. So people should really treat information that's posted on dating sites as suspect, because it's created by the individual and there's no ability to triangulate that information using other sources. Meaning, you can basically post whatever nonsense you want about yourself on a dating profile and people aren't really going to know any different. So online relationships can lead to marriage more quickly than those formed in some other ways. And the reason this is because the couples get to know each other online before they meet each other. So there can be that kind of deeper connection when you talk to each other before you meet. But couples who meet online and marry are 3 times more likely to divorce than couples who meet in more conventional ways. So the use of social media really distracts from face-to-face relationships. And in addition, the use of social media by couples is linked to greater self-reported relational conflict. So that also affects people once they are in those relationships together. Okay, so some more problems from social media. So social media and culture, when you look at the increasing use of social media, this is affecting our culture. So one problem is the high level of online violence, which numbs us to the horror of violence that we, experience in the actual world. And it can actually encourage some people to engage in more violence because it just normalizes that, or glorifies or, again, promotes violence. So much of the content on social media also glorifies risk. So critics of social media suggest that such content can encourage others to engage in risky or, problematic behaviors. There's also what's called the shallow culture hypothesis. So critics of social media claim that the expanding use of social media encourages a superficial and morally shallow way of life. Research links heavy use of social media to young people valuing physical beauty, making money, and being popular more than other factors. So yeah, there's this really fear that through so much more use of social media, we're creating more shallow people and a shallow culture, right? Also, when it comes to work, social media is now a major tool for search for work. Computer technology allows employers to monitor the behaviors of their workers. So, hint, if your profiles are public, make them private. That's my biggest suggestion to you, because I know from my experience, people look at them and employers look at them and they want to kind of see who are you, what are you putting out there in the world. And as we've seen in recent years, thankfully, people posting like really dumb or racist stuff on their pages can actually make them lose their jobs, right? Which they deserve to when they're posting really dumb, hateful, racist stuff. But anyway, also when it comes to social media and politics, social media is widely used by political leaders to try to influence public opinion. So again, Trump was very well known for his tweets. And really all candidates running for office now use, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, all sorts of social media sites to try to get their message out there to the public. Also, when it comes to social media, this can also affect problems involving information. So, meaning managing and controlling information is a problem. So, for instance, during the 2016 election, Russian agents made use of Facebook accounts to sway public opinion in the United States. Facebook has acknowledged that information about its 2 billion members may have been harvested by various persons or organizations. So again, trying to tip the scales in a way that benefits their own self-interest, that's very scary and problematic. And why is it that social media really affects information? It's because people are more likely to trust something on social media if it comes from someone they know or some outlet that they trust. Versus, just listening to the corporate news. We all know that mainstream news has biases, has problems, has limitations on their scope of what they cover. And so this can lead people to just kind of ignore those media sources completely, instead of just taking those sources with a grain of salt or using multiple sources from different angles to get better perspectives. People just turn to Facebook and they think, my cousin shared this article, so therefore it must be relevant. And what's actually really interesting is research looked at Facebook and found that the things that are the most likely to be shared are the things that are the craziest. Like during the 2016 election, the idea that Hillary Clinton was a body double. Because, there was this, let me take you back in time. There was this moment, there was a 9/11 memorial event, and after the event, she collapsed getting into a truck, or getting into a van. And the reason was Hillary had pneumonia at the time. And personally, as a person who's had pneumonia a couple times, actually had it this last year, I wouldn't be doing anything. I literally, getting out of bed and walking to the bathroom was the highlight of my entire day. That's how much you can move when you have pneumonia. She went out in public, dressed nice, stood for hours at this memorial event, and then passed out as she was getting into the car. Not that surprising if you've ever had pneumonia, but it became this right-wing troll thing that she died that day, and that the other woman still running on the campaign trail was a body double, and that got shared 500,000 times on Facebook. So the wilder and the crazier and the more insane the story is, actually the more traction it tends to get on social media. So that's very problematic from a societal perspective of how do we get good information? Because people say, well, I heard on Facebook that this or that. And you're like, yeah, but how did you independently verify that information? So much of the stuff you see on there, you can just Google it and be like, oh, well, that's BS, in 5 seconds. And especially the more crazy it sounds, the more BS it obviously is. But again, it creates this kind of situation where people will share it farther and wide. And in the case of the Russian agents trying to sway public opinion in the United States, they did it, right? They had an effect on people's perspectives, and that's very scary. Okay, so then looking at sociological theories and how they understand social media. So structural functional theory would really look at the functions of social media. And functionalism would basically identify 6 functions of mass media and social media for the operation of society. 1, that social media is an agent of socialization, right? It basically teaches us what it is to be a member of our society. 2, social media advances a uniform culture. So we kind of get this, normalized sense of, we all kind of conform to something. 3, social media increases social integration. So the idea that maybe more of us are kind of interacting in a very similar way because we're all scrolling on our phones. 4, social media is an agent of social control, right? So think about how much time you waste on your phone looking at other people's lives when you could be doing something productive, or just even like a big one nowadays is like just a little self-care. Like take, instead of the time you would have spent on Instagram, and take that time like meditating. Take that time just stretching your body or going for a walk. The mental health benefits are going to be so great. You're going to feel so much better. Or in the case of myself, what I wish I could do is, instead of spending a couple hours scrolling through social media, actually put my clean laundry away. If you're like me, you do a couple loads of laundry, and that's fine. That part's easy. But then it's getting them back like where it's supposed to go. It takes some extra time. But again, if our day is like, well, I'm going to lay down and scroll through media for a minute, those things really get set aside. And so again, as social control too, though, it can really inform us about what's considered appropriate in the culture and what's not. So social media can be really problematic, especially if you look at countries like China, where they don't allow outside Western social media aspects. The only news you get is centralized from China. Also, number 5, social media is a source of entertainment and stability. So it is a way to kind of escape our lives and spend a little time kind of trying to see what's going on in quote unquote the world. And 6, social media is a source of change. So social media can be great for activism and community building, right? We have things like Black Lives Matter that really came out of hashtags and created a movement. You have, the Me Too movement, Time's Up, these kind of things that really, because of social media, have been able to elevate problems that have largely not been addressed. So again, social media can be a way for us to kind of help build activism communities and address social problems. So it's an interesting phenomenon, social media. It can be really good, it can be really bad. It just depends on how we use it and if we give ourselves space and time to kind of reflect in a human way. And then symbolic interaction theory is always trying to look at how we, create reality through interactions. So social media and reality construction is what they're interested in. So symbolic interaction highlights how social media is central to the social construction of reality in everyday life. News reports, for example, are selective accounts shaped by a political viewpoint and a company's desire to increase their audience. So we have to understand the perspectives of where things are coming from, like influencers, for example, right? The way that they portray their lives and the way that they do things is because they're trying to sell you on something. So when you understand that, it's easier to kind of navigate or use that information as you would, and not get swayed by the kind of myth of like, this could be you, quit your job and become a TikTok celebrity, right? Because you don't see like all the hours going into them making and producing these videos and all the debt that they're probably in. Anyway, and then looking at social conflict theory, they really look at social media through the lens of social inequality. So they argue that, social media creates more inequality. So from a Marxist perspective, media organizations are large profit-seeking corporations, and over time, the share of all media outlets owned and controlled by a small number of individuals and corporations has increased, a pattern of what we call media consolidation. And this is a huge problem in our culture right now, right? We have almost 90% of all media is controlled by a handful of corporations, just 6 corporations. And so that means the messages they put out have an impact, right? So if they want to frame things in a particular way, then that's the majority of all media you're going to hear on the radio, see on TV, find in a newspaper, magazine, through social media, any of these kind of things. So, that's incredibly problematic, this issue of media consolidation, because it really affects what kind of messages are sent through the culture and who gets to control that, and when more and more powers is centralized into very, very corporate wealthy hands. Okay, so then feminist theory also looks at, from a conflict perspective, social media, but looking at the issue of gender. So they link social media through feminist theory to gender stratification, because media content both reflects inequality based on gender, but in so many ways, it also helps perpetuate inequality based on gender, especially this idea that women are sex objects, or, that you should care more about what a woman looks like than anything else about her. That is really being promoted through social media, right? We don't even listen to influencers that aren't attractive. So that really kind of cuts out, and why are we following who we're following? It might just be because of, the kind of scantily clad posts that they make, or the scintillating, videos or whatever, and not, basically just kind of promoting this world in which women are sex objects and not people, and, kind of, again, further distancing ourselves from interactions with each other where we kind of learn to understand and respect each other, right? Okay, so what do we do about it? Right? Obviously, like every chapter, there's some various perspectives on what we do. So a wide range of media represents important sources of information, right? Media is always going to play an important role in how we come to define social problems. Because if you don't see something reported on the news, then you might not even know it's a thing, right? Or like, let's say, the way that they characterize Black Lives Matter as a movement affects the way that then people interpret and either support or don't support the movement. And I think this is very true when it comes to specifically conservative media, the way that they've maligned Black Lives Matter, the way they've maligned Me Too movement, and really, especially the Me Too movement. Oh, girl. How many conservatives lost their jobs because of the Me Too movement, right? Like Roger Ailes, the long-time producer and manager of, of Fox News, for running a atmosphere that promoted, sexual harassment for over 30 years. He got fired from the Me Too movement. Bill O'Reilly got fired from the Me Too movement. Like, so many of those dudes, the receipts came out, and they had already paid off dozens of people these, what they call non-disclosure agreements, right, NDAs, where they agreed to not tell anyone that this guy's a sexually harassing jerk, as long as, they're not allowed to talk about it, and they receive like $10 million instead. So just for Bill O'Reilly, I mean, Fox paid out millions of dollars in harassment suits for that guy. Anyway, so, yeah, it makes sense that a program like Fox News would be pretty demonizing of the Me Too movement when it literally knocked out, like, the guy in charge of the network. It knocked out a bunch of the people who worked there. Anyway, so it is interesting how the media reports on or defines social problems affects how we then view them as social problems. And again, how one views the media depends on your own position on the political spectrum and really the perspective of that media source that it's promoting. So first, with conservatives in the far right, they look at honoring tradition. So from a conservative point of view, mass media and social media are essential to organize social life involving more than 300 million people in this country. At the same time, though, media can direct attention away from traditional culture. Most young people, for example, spend more time on their smartphones than they do interacting with teachers or parents or, other people in society. So conservatives claim that most types of mainstream media has a liberal bias. So from a far right point of view, critics of mass media point to media silence about what they see as a cultural and economic decline in the United States. That's, from the very far right, they're also, trying to promote a very different understanding about America that gets people really riled up, that, they need to fight to get their country back and this kind of thing. And again, think about it. Getting people angry means that they tune in again. So it's good for their bottom line as media corporations. For liberals, they look at supporting a more progressive agenda. So from a liberal point of view, mass media and social media can do a lot to support progressive agendas by calling attention to inequality and supporting the formation of social movements that can bring about change. Again, that Me Too example, right? In opposition to sexual assault. It's one example of how social media can be harnessed to actually have positive transformational change from a progressive point of view. And then the radical left really looks at media as big business, right? Meaning, from a far left point of view, major media outlets are large, privately owned corporations, and these corporations may support progressive causes, but critics on the far left claim that they're unlikely to challenge the capitalistic system itself because, that's what pays them. So if you want to know more about this kind of argument, there's this great piece done on Last Week Tonight, right, with John Oliver, that's on HBO, which I don't have HBO either, I just watch it on YouTube. But anyway, he did this one about the Sinclair Broadcasting Group, which I highly suggest you look at. It's one corporation with conservative political leanings that owns and controls some 200 television stations in the U.S., with programming available to half of all U.S. households. So one corporation has media that's present within half of all US households. And if you watch the Sinclair Broadcasting video from John Oliver and Last Week Tonight, he shows this kind of very Orwellian, scary thing where they basically like send out copy to all of the journalists at all of the stations, which goes against how a lot of local media journalism is supposed to work, right? Like they might set up like certain topics you should cover or certain things like that, but typically the reporting is done in a local sense. From these Sinclair broadcasting groups, they have certain media pieces that are played across all ones, all of their channels, and they have copy that they provide to reporters that they have to read. All of them have to read it. So he clips it all together so you can hear them all saying it the exact same way at the exact same time. And just how like completely scary that is, right? Very Orwellian. So anyway, highly suggest that if you want to know more about some of the ways in which, media itself, again, is unlikely to challenge a capitalistic system that pays their bills. And that John Oliver clip really gets to the heart of it. And then, of course, going on from here, the expansion of mass media and the emergence of social media have really greatly increased people's access to information. And nowadays, we have greater connectivity than we ever did before. So whether this networking power will enhance democracy or provide better power to elites, this remains to be seen, right? It kind of has both so far. And so there's little doubt that social media supports the formation of social movements that seek change, and that's very positive to get people connected across, the world when it comes to things like Black Lives Matter. So social media companies have really won over the market of, people that were born, what they call the I generation, people born after 1995. And so to expand their market, it's likely that social media companies are going to intensify their efforts to engage with younger and younger children, which again can cause more social problems that we haven't really clearly defined yet. So this is going to keep changing and it's ever in flux, and it is an interesting concept from a sociological point of view to try to understand.